Good afternoon, everybody. I drew the right after lunch card, which hopefully at least the first part will be, really good for attention. I am really excited to talk to you today about this work that we're doing in the Western Interconnection, both because it's interesting for the geography that we applied it to, but also because the approaches that we used in this study, I think, are really broadly useful and applicable in a lot of different regions, as well as on both an interconnection and individual utility system level. I should note also that I'm also accompanied at this conference by a couple of my colleagues who worked and with me and really helped this be a really advantageous project. So Jimmy Nelson, Chen Zhang, and Cameron Morelli all worked on this project, and hopefully if you have extra technical questions or other detail that you want to talk to them about, feel free to find them later in this conference. They have, I will add, this is my family's place in El Campo, Texas. I'm originally from Texas, so I very much appreciate the choice of venue to get to be back in Texas now. And if you have Texas history questions, I think my colleagues from E3 have already heard all that they want to know, so feel free to come and talk to me if you don't get it from the CPS team or someone else. Real quick on E3, we have about 150 consultants, all really, really great people to work with, and over 6 offices now. We've got Chicago, Calgary, and Denver added recently to our mix. And I would just say that one of the things that we really benefit from is getting to work with a really wide range of different clients, over 150 different clients and about 400 projects a year. So it lets each of us really see things from a lot of different perspectives. We work with utility regulators and state agencies, as well as utilities and ISOs and investors and project developers. So it's really helpful, I think, for framing problems to be able to see it from the shoes of each of those different types of entities. So jumping into what we're going to talk about today, there's just a couple of context pieces that I wanted to mention about the Western Interconnection, many of which you probably already know. The first that should be obvious from the map, it's a really big geography. It ranges all the way from El Paso over to the Pacific Ocean, and from Mexicali down in Baja all the way up to BC and Alberta, which covers about 90 million people and has a peak demand, if you added it all up together, of about 170 gigawatts overall. So that's the first thing, which should be clear there. The other thing that I think is relevant for this is that historically it has been planned and operated in a very disparate way, with over 50 different transmission owners having different pieces of the system and having to work together. Nearly 40 different balancing authorities operationally dispatching generators and balancing out their systems in coordination with their neighbors. And some of that has improved over time. In the early 2010s, FERC Order 1000 encouraged entities to plan at a wider sort of regional level. And so this lower left map here, or lower right map from your perspective, shows the 3 different planning regions within the WEC, which is West Connect in the Southwest and sort of the Rockies, Northern Grid, and then California ISO. But even with that, one of the sort of final features of the West that's really important is the diversity that it has over this broad geographic region. And so you can see that pretty easily, just looking at wind and solar potential maps, just for one aspect of that. You've got really good wind quality in the far eastern portion of the interconnection, really good solar quality in the far south portion of the interconnection. And beyond that, there's a lot of other types of diversity, like winter peaking and summer peaking systems, and more hydro in certain portions of the area, like in the Pacific Northwest. And so because of that, there is potentially opportunities for value for planning it and thinking about long-term planning on a broader geographic level than simply within one state or even sort of one portion of the states. On the other hand, it's also a challenging issue just because of the scale and the number of entities that need to be involved in doing that. So WestTEC, or the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, was an organization that was a group that was developed 3 years ago, starting 3 years ago, and really have gotten into it over the last 2 years as part of the Western Power Pool to look at transmission opportunities from a full region-wide basis and look for where value could be created. It is led by Sarah Edmonds at the Western Power Pool, or sponsored by that. It's really unique in that it's an industry-led organization with a really wide range of partners, ranging from tribal organizations, state agencies, utilities, ISOs, and load and generation developers. And so within that, it's a good place to bring together lots of information and update that in a real-time setting. For that work, E3, my firm, has partnered with Energy Strategies, and we're working together with all these stakeholders to create both a 10 and 20-year transmission study that we hope provides information that creates an actionable transmission plan for the different entities who are involved and the different planners in the region to be able to really identify if they're doing planning for an individual line or an individual sub-region, how does that fit into opportunities at a bigger, wider lens picture across the interconnection. So one of the real challenges within that context is the time horizon. So on a 10-year time horizon, particularly in the West, there's already processes to aggregate a lot of information about existing plans. And even though things may change somewhat within that 10-year time horizon, there's at least decent information already about, and sort of a bright light on what are potential generation resources that are going to be added, what are potential load growth expectations in different portions of the interconnection. And so the transmission plan can really dive deep and get into detail about how can transmission help serve and optimize power delivery to those particular loads from those particular generators. When we look out further, though, to that 20-year time horizon, it gets much darker. I think I might have had a similar image here, sort of the same imagery as David did earlier in the morning, except I don't have a bowl. I guess that's an absence. But really, when you look at it, though, at a 20-year time horizon, there's a lot of uncertainties in terms of load growth, policy, and technology changes that could really impact what is the best and the likely build-out of different generation in different locations, which then in turn will affect what transmission would be the right transmission or the most optimal transmission to be able to build to connect that. Additionally, it becomes, within that context, what I would often refer to as a chicken or the egg problem, which is essentially that where the generation is most optimal to build and what kind of generation is optimal to build is really dependent on what transmission is built as well. And those two problems are really linked. I've seen this a lot in individual studies across my career when different entities are looking for cost-benefit evaluations of different individual transmission projects or portfolios of projects. And there's always this tension that stands out where, if you think about it broadly, if you assume that there's no transmission in place and you build generation sort of in an optimal way, you're going to likely put the generation where existing transmission is or where it's easy to connect to existing transmission. And if you do that, then the region will be relatively filled up or relatively satisfied with that sort of close to load generation that you have on the system. And the value of building incremental transmission to more remote locations or more far-flung regions or neighboring regions where you might get more diversity between those different systems diminishes because you've already got that generation in place. On the other hand, I've seen other places where ISOs or utilities instead go the opposite way, and they just put the generation in place based on resource potential and what sort of just from a purely generation perspective would be the lowest cost place to put in the generation. And so if you do that, you might happen to have generation that's really far from transmission. And conditional on that happening, then the value of having more transmission to interconnect that generation that's barely connected or maybe even not even connected, so just getting all curtailed, starts to become really high. And so it sort of answers the question as a sort of default yes in the other direction. So what's really tough, though, is trying to think about how do those generation build decisions, the transmission build decisions, sort of interact jointly. And unfortunately, you can't really just wait for the 10-year horizon to come about where more of these knowns get put into place because of the fact that a lot of the transmission corridors and other planning issues take longer than 10 years often to really get done and really get into place. Moreover, with FERC Order 1920, there's more and more impetus and orders to be able to motivate and really sort of push areas to plan on that 20-year or 20-year plus basis. So with WestTEC, we dug into this 20-year planning problem, largely by breaking this problem up into different pieces. So WED3 and my team, Jimmy Chen, Cameron, and I have worked together to really focus on the capacity expansion problem, that generation transmission build out first, at a relatively higher zonal level that then can get passed to our colleagues at Energy Strategies, who then dig into that more deeply with detailed power flow assessments and congestion studies on a nodal basis to get a greater amount of detail about how different, very specific transmission options might play out in that context. Finally, we collaborate together within WestTEC for looking at the value proposition of what would be the benefits of individual transmission or portfolio transmission to get. But zooming in today on the work that we and my team is most familiar with, that capacity expansion modeling, when we look at it on a 20-year basis, I think really there's some sub-questions that play out in this that are really important for thinking about. And when we first got asked to do this work, we all got together in a room, I think probably a couple of virtual whiteboards out, because it really was a tough one to even approach because of the large number of different factors that all come together from the broader region. I think some of them that come out, I think, this is sort of a sampling of some of the questions that we were asking ourselves. I think one is trying to create a model to answer what is sort of that question of, is it better, what are the trade-offs of building more transmission to a cheaper resource that's farther away versus building generation that's more local to one's own area? But not just sort of on an isolated basis for an individual line, but rather how does that interact with the build out of potential other transmission over this 20-year horizon that could be useful for other neighbors in the region as well? And then finally, how do you integrate this to think about that joint value, not just of the transmission for delivering energy or reducing congestion, but also how that transmission is potentially supporting resource adequacy in those individual regions and reliability, and how it is potentially for regions that have, and for states that have specific policy targets for particular resource procurement, how can you integrate that into the system? So we found this as an ideal application really for the PLEXOS LT optimization with our modeling team. I think if these problems are defined effectively, and it did take some work to really think about how to formulate some of these issues together so that we could make it tractable to the PLEXOS LT system, then we could really peel this together and get a really good co-optimized solution and really good information. So a couple of the components that we did to really break that down, one was to really create a strong scenario basis for defining individual scenarios of different potential futures that could play out in terms of load growth, technology changes for generation, and different policies for different states in the region. The second is there was a lot of choice that our team had to make in balancing out the trade-offs between granularity and detail versus runtime and just sort of having sort of too much complexity potentially at certain points on both a time basis, so which affected the number of years that we were modeling and the number of hours we modeled within each year, as well as the geographic granularity of deciding how big different zones would be versus modeling individual nodes within the system. And finally, we needed a method to be able to track some individual delivery of particular types of generation that are used to either support resource adequacy in particular states or particular zones, or the policy goals of those zones. So jumping into that, for WestTEC, there were three major scenarios that we used to bookend the case. This is a layout of those. We had significant stakeholder input from that WestTEC group of stakeholders to be able to inform what to do here and what was sort of a reasonable set of cases and a useful set of cases that as a package would give us a sense of robustness when we look across the overall context of results. And so the reference scenario had sort of a moderate growth rate, which is actually quite high compared to historical looks, but obviously thinking about electrification as well as data center and other industrial load growth is sort of much more in line with that projection in the West. We had a moderate innovation trajectory and supporting policy for the cost of new technologies like solar, wind, batteries, as well as nuclear and geothermal and hydrogen and other resources. And then we had basically what was in existing statutes for the GHG policies of individual states. So some states didn't have any policies in place, others did. And so we had that sort of heterogeneity built into our WestTEC model. On top of that, there's a flux case, which basically increases load growth and increases the policy targets there, but also increases the level of technological advancement. And so this case was intended in some ways to show potentially more appetite in the region for greater amounts of transmission to be able to see what opportunities would turn out in that kind of a future world. And then finally, we had a core case which sort of backed off it relative to the reference case. And so we slowed down the load growth to some extent, increased some of the technology costs, although had some amount of improvement, particularly in base load technologies that could be located closer to load, and then also reduced and sort of delayed some of the policy targets in that scenario. And so that was with the intent to be able to see if some of the major drivers for transmission were moderated a bit, what transmission still shows up as useful and needed in this scenario to create what many refer to as sort of a least regrets type of transmission plan. In terms of implementation, we divided the WEC up into about 40 different zones. The black lines in the chart here indicate the locations of those, and the gray, to the extent that you can see it, is the width of those represents the size of the different existing interties in megawatts between these different zones and transmission that sort of spans these different zones that we have. And we used GIS support with, together with Energy Strategies and Montero Mountain Energy, collaboration to identify resources, and also the links of different transmission to connect make new connections between these zones. And then use some E3 in-house tools, our pathways model for looking at long-term electrification over a long horizon and other large load additions, our recost model, which looks at projections of technology costs with sort of consistent financing assumptions on all the different technologies as well as transmission. And then our recot model, which is our loss of load probability model, which largely in this context helps us be able to see what the effective load carrying capability is for different resources that we could add to meet that growth that we see on the system, and how that changes as the build out of one particular type of resource, let's say, for instance, solar in California, how basically the marginal or new amount of capacity that you're getting from incremental additions of solar may diminish for additional megawatts after you have a lot already in place. Finally, our team had a really innovative approach to create remote resource options in PLEXOS to basically allow resources, for instance, in Wyoming to be able to be used to specifically meet needs in the state of Washington or California and comply with different policies or resource adequacy needs in those regions, while also setting aside transmission to be able to make sure that there's transmission available to be able to get to those regions. And so within this, we allowed the model to be able to expand any of these transmission connections between zones on a linear basis up to sort of a max value of roughly 5,000 megawatts, though usually most of the selections were smaller than that overall. And we put it in some planned generation there. I think one important choice that our team realized in putting this together was that it's important to think about whether you're setting aside the transmission for delivering these types of remote resources, whether you're setting aside transmission in all hours at, for instance, the nameplate of the generation that you're sort of procuring from a remote area and sort of letting that transmission lay fallow during hours when that generation is not operating, when the wind that you procured is not blowing or the solar's not shining, or whether to just set aside only the capacity that actually would be equivalent to the generation dispatch of that capacity. So in terms of results, we have detailed results sort of at an individual level for each of those 40 zones and lots of individual technology. And I just spotted here the capacity, something got cut off here, so it's actually, there should be an extra comma 000 on the capacity side here. But this is the overall generation build for these different regions by the 2045 year. Under the far left bars are a reference case, the middle bar is that flux case with higher amounts of generation and transmission build, and the far right is that core case with sort of a more conservative outlook for growth. It's probably more useful to just see what the changes are over time. So this is just to look at that last 10 years of resources selected by the model, what resources were added. And so again, these resources in these zones were selected jointly with the transmission additions to connect them between regions. And so you have that co-optimization effect happening. Overall, I think it was a nice range that we ended up having because roughly if you added up for the whole Western interconnection of all these sort of sub-regions, the flux case, that's sort of those middle bars, ended up being about twice the nameplate capacity of the reference case. And the core case ended up being about half the reference case total capacity build out. And so it really did give the sort of broad range of resource plans to be able to use to think through what would be the transmission needs to serve all of those and then think through sort of how to break down those scenarios overall. I'm gonna wrap up here. I think there are a couple of final summary thoughts that I had. I think some are obvious and then some are potential extensions that we have of this. So I think the obvious one is just that clearly long-term transmission has many complex and sort of interdependent issues associated with it, which I'm sure many of you who are dealing with this kind of issue can attest to. And I think though within that PLEXOS, the PLEXOS LT model, particularly if it's in the right hands, I would say, really skilled operators who know how to break down issues well and with the right data inputs put into it, can be a really powerful tool for exploring a lot of these interconnected issues. And as a really powerful tool for really cracking that chicken or the egg problem with effective co-optimization of the generation and transmission. I think there are definitely ways that we can refine it, and this is the first round of WestTEC that we had here. If we have the opportunity in the future, or someone has the opportunity in the future to be able to continue to iterate on it, I think there's a lot of feedback of that downstream power flow and congestion modeling that Energy Strategies did that could come back in and inform the set of new transmission options that we put into the model as a first place of sort of options to build onto for the model. And so I think it's definitely sort of a platform that can be improved as the data inputs improve. There's also ways I think that we see that could be really useful for improving just the algorithms and the setup of this. I think probably one of the most important ones is thinking through how these ELCC curves or these sort of the capacity contribution curves change when you're connecting different regions. So for instance, if you're getting resources from a more remote region, the shape of those resources, this wind or solar, really any kind of resource might be different than the one locally, and so might provide potentially more capacity than a local resource, or might not, depending on the particular situation. And the final one is not something contemplated in WestTEC, but I think is just, I think, notable to us when we thought about this, was just really this formulation of cooptimizing the generation and transmission at a regional level, or even if you broke it down at a utility level, could be extended to really loads as well. If you thought about that as a generation, it's sort of equivalent, or a negative generation system in here, in that you could, particularly if you had large loads at a point location, you could put those large loads in different areas and have that be an opportunity for growth and an opportunity for the model to choose where the best location of those is for optimizing and providing both reliability of the system, but also trying to minimize the overall cost, subject to a total amount of new load that you might want to add to the system in aggregate. So that's definitely, I think our industry faces a challenge of, there's less that's nailed down than there was in the past, but fortunately there's, I think, tools that we have that could answer some of those questions, or at least inform some of those questions. So that is, that's all I had for today. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, if anyone has them. Right there. I can repeat it too.
You had mentioned that you guys looked at nameplate transmission and use transmission. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So if you think about it, if you need transmission, if you're building a transmission project specifically to deliver resources from one location to a different location, there's, in the real world, there's lots of different contractual applications that people can have. You can either hold all that transmission back and basically, say that transmission's dedicated for just that generation to come through, or you could potentially backfill some of that transmission with other generation when the procured generation isn't dispatching. And so I think our model found, and just sort of our explorations definitely saw that the more that you're able to enable the model to do some of this backfilling or some of this sort of extra purposes of the existing transmission, the more you can get some of that, ultimately just the less overall transmission you're probably going to need to build in aggregate to meet the needs that you have. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, right there. Thanks, Bree.
It becomes especially the case when it comes to transmission, because the line in general expands multiple BAs, each optimizing for their own. So how would you navigate through those kind of market sims when it comes to maybe optimizing over a total benefit versus accounting for the separate BAs? So that's the first question. The second is, historically, we kind of viewed WEC as on its own with a limited amount of power transmission with other interconnections. But for example, the RTO West just kicked off at 2 weeks earlier, allowing some power exchange between WEC and SPP. Do you think that will signal a more different transmission, even power landscape in the future, or promote such interface between interconnections?
Yeah, two great questions. So I think on the first one, WEC is definitely known as having a lot of different BAs that all historically have operated independently, have been pulled together a little bit more in a real-time market recently, but then that's sort of going into sort of two different day-ahead and real-time market camps. So I think that definitely is a challenge for joint planning. Fortunately for this study, we didn't need to get into cost allocation for individual entities. I think it's an important consideration for sure to have. I think, though, at the same time, when we're looking over this long time horizon where there's a really big task of growth that you have, I think it is important to sort of step back and say, what would be valuable to the system as a whole over this long time horizon, and then dig into the cost allocation questions sort of separately. On your second question of connections between the WEC and Eastern Interconnection, or maybe ERCOT, we didn't look at that specifically in the study. There was one individual resource with transmission that we did have to get to North Dakota. That was sort of one amount of addition that was included in this analysis. But incremental opportunities, I think, are good ones to have. And I think that's a really good example of the fact that if we're looking at things on a broader and broader geography, we need more tools and more approaches to be able to really think about that value over a wide geography, which I think this lends itself well to. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that all transmission is the right answer in many ways. I think there's many situations where part of the value of this is helping you think about what transmission might you not really need to build, or might it be better to build different generation mixes instead of to really keep costs low for customers. But yeah, that's useful. Yeah, I think we've got time for one more, and then need to go. I'll be brief here.
Hi, thank you for the overview of your approach. Can you go back a couple of slides? I had a question on the process flow. Yeah, how did the recap model and the capacity expansion in PLEXOS kind of play out? Because you're talking about E3s. So
Yeah.
You basically are thinking of renewable expansion exogenous to PLEXOS and then building transmission? That wasn't
Yeah,
clear
so
to me.
we're thinking about the renewable expansion endogenously to PLEXOS. So that's all within PLEXOS LT. But the exogenous piece that we need to make that work is to be able to see what is the resource adequacy contribution or capacity contribution that those incremental resources are having to each region. Because really each region is trying to meet three objectives. One is the energy balance. Two is the policy, to the extent that there's a policy constraint for a region. The third is the resource adequacy need. That's not just defined exclusively by whether the model can serve load in the individual hours that we modeled, but rather more from a broader planning basis, is there enough capacity for each of the subzones that we have? And so to be able to do that, our recap model gives us information on how resources added in any of these sort of sub-regions would provide and contribute new or incremental capacity to the region for meeting that resource adequacy or capacity need. And how that changes as you sort of add more and more resources with a particular type within that, so that we have a sort of curve built in to be able to identify that selection. And so as a result, that can lead to things like a model choosing potentially to get a different technology that might be on a nameplate basis more expensive, but might contribute more from a capacity perspective. Yeah. I need to check with the Exemplar team. How are we on time? Do you have time for another question, or should we switch to the next speaker? Okay, sure. Yeah, Jonathan. Right?
Emanuele Bobbio with PJM.
Sorry.
I was just wondering if you could provide an intuition for the results on slide 13, particularly the location of the storage. So the storage seems to be concentrated in the south, and I was wondering how that interplays with the transmission choices in the model. Then we have the wind that is more in the west, but it's not coupled with storage. So how is that working? How is the storage location working with the transmission and the renewables in the south and in the west?
Yeah, how does that transmission that's sort of heavily concentrated in the south satisfying the full system? I think probably two major issues for the west affect that. So the first is that a lot of these regions do have at least some amount of storage added. Some of that's sort of planned storage, so it's before the period that we start adding transmission for. So there's a little bit of storage there. The other thing is, particularly the Northwest has existing base of a lot of hydro generation for balancing out resources. And so that, from at least sort of a system-wide basis, we see acts somewhat as a substitute for battery storage, and so reduces the need for the model to pick incremental storage. I think one of the things that we have been finding when you look at when you zone into a lower level of granularity, sort of sub areas or individual substations, there can be pockets where even though on a system basis you're good from a storage perspective, or you may be good from a storage perspective, that incremental storage could be good for those individual locations. Yeah. Great. Yeah, hi. Yep.
You mentioned that you had some GIS support. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just curious, was that GIS analysis done sort of on the front end to help develop constraints for the inputs, or was that sort of looked at as an after effect to the LT capacity expansion modeling?
There's GIS done on both ends. So yeah, on the front end, we needed to have a good representation of how within each of these zones that we're modeling, what's the resource potential and what's sort of the cost tiers of that resource potential that we can add. So that was the GIS that was done there that was really helpful for sort of stocking the model with options of what to build and what that costs. And then on the back end, once we had these results, there was a big effort by the rest of the broader team working on WestTEC to downscale that and sort of map these resources to individual bus bars.
Okay. Was
to-
the GIS used at all to look at like the transmission routing?
Yes,
in any way?
it was, yeah. So the cost that we show it as a straight line here just for simplicity, but yes, our GIS team worked a lot to try to think about what potential distances were, as well as terrain that should cover that could affect the cost of incremental transmission.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great. Well, as always, yeah, feel free to contact us if you have other questions, and happy to talk about it more at this conference. It's really great to have been with you all today.